Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's program. My name is Yonit Behar, and I'm the assistant curator at DePaul Art Museum. And I'm beyond delighted to see you here and that you decided to join us this evening. DPAM is currently presenting the exhibition For You by Ayanah Moor in our Fullerton CTA billboard space, which is on view now through December 28th. And as well as an installation by artist Catherine Andrews in our front-facing windows through December 20th. As part of the programming around Ayanah's exhibition, today's conversation between artists Ayanah, Nate Young, and Nyeema Morgan directly addresses many of the concepts brought up in Ayanah's own work, especially ideas around empathy. I would like to read now an excerpt of the text that Nyeema wrote for this event, and I'm going to quote this short excerpt. She says, "The precarity of 2020 has brought American ideological conflict to a head. Against the glaring bias of American meritocracy, the corrosions of civil discourse, and the rise of antisocialism and the sociopathic hero is an appeal to empathy, a viable strategy for resolving conflict, one that is predicated on misunderstanding. Ayanah's billboard installation For You challenges us to question our personal and collective progress, intentions and methods of change surrounding issues of equity and inclusion. Are our alliances swift and superficial, or deeply rooted and ready for hard-fought change?" Nate Young's work at the Driehaus Museum for the exhibition A Tale of Today, Nate Young and Mika Horibuchi, explores themes of familial and collective history, while his skillful woodwork recalls the same craftsmanships used to build the Nickerson Mansion. Now let me introduce you to each of the panelists. Ayanah Moor is an artist living and working in Chicago. Through her paintings, prints, drawings, and performance, Moor operates within a visual field where notions of Blackness and gender identity take shape. She utilizes existing material and cultural artifacts to generate alternative histories, often repositioning the subject as a corrective gesture, or to create counter-narratives. Vintage advertisements, athletic competitions, reimagined slogans, and healing practices have fueled recent projects. Her work engages subversive and demonstrative displays of Blackness that locate love, myth, fear, and desire. Moore earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Virginia Commonwealth University and a Master's of Fine Arts from Tyler School of Art, Temple University. Her exhibitions include the Museum of Contemporary Art, the DePaul Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Chicago, and many more. Nate Young received his BA from Northwestern College, St. Paul, Minnesota. Nate Young went on to receive his MFA from California Institute of the Arts and to complete a residency at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in 2009. Working across media in a manner that challenges traditional modes of artistic production, Young creates works that engage with issues of race and racialization. Young's recent solo and two-person exhibitions, and I'm just going to name a few, include A Tale of Tomorrow at the Driehaus, as I mentioned, The Transcendence of Time at Monique Meloche, the Deepry Gallery, Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and Well at Julius Caesar here in Chicago, as I said, and many more. His works are in collections, including the Walker Arts Center, the Smithsonian, Modwarsh Collection, and he's also a co-founder and director of the artist-run exhibition Space, the Bindery Projects in Minneapolis. And he currently is teaching as an assistant professor at UIC. Nyeema Morgan is an interdisciplinary artist based in Chicago whose conceptually layered works, ranging from large-scale drawings to sculptural installation and print-based media, raise questions about how we articulate and construct meaning within a complex system of socio-political relations. Nyeema earned her BFA from Cooper Union School and an MFA from California College of the Arts. She had solo and two-person exhibitions, including the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art in Boulder, Colorado, the Marlborough Contemporary in New York, as well as group exhibitions at the Drawing Center in New York, the Studio Museum, Harlem, and many more. She has had residencies at the Skowhegan School of Painting, and I'm just very abbreviating everyone's bios for everyone's sakes, but they're three unbelievable, amazing artists. So with that, I want to thank each of our panelists and every one of you for being here today. And now I'm going to turn it to Nyeema. Thank you.
Thank you, Yonit. And a big thanks to DePaul Art Museum for bringing us all together. I was really excited to be in conversation with Nate and Ayanah. You know, I've known Nate for what feels like too long, right? 2009 at Skowhegan. Yeah. You know, and by coincidence, we actually went to high school together, but didn't know each other. So we had some overlap there in Minneapolis, you know, so we've had plenty of studio visits, but we've never really sat down formally. Is this formal? It's formal. You know, in front of an audience to talk about, your work and the ideas behind your work. And Ayanah, you were one of the first people that I had the pleasure of meeting when I moved to Chicago 2 years ago. And when I first met you, I spoke to you briefly. We lived in the same neighborhood. We would pass by each other on the street. But after briefly speaking to you, I was like, I'm gonna be okay. Because I came to Chicago in a whirlwind and I was like, where am I? What am I doing? You know, and then I met you, I was like, all right, it'll be good. Yes. And then I got to know your work a little bit more and I felt, you know, like, all right. Yeah. Very comforting to be, you know, in your peer group here, you know, in Chicago. So this is really wonderful for me. And there's some commonalities in I think all of our works and our practices. And I specifically wanted to talk about the subject of empathy, mostly because I, like a lot of people, are just kind of consumed with the cultural climate, you know, the political, social climate that we're in, and this kind of ideological estrangement that we're experiencing. And then also with the pandemic, you know, that happened before, but also with the pandemic, now we're physically kind of removed from each other. So we're communicating to each other through this distance, you know, and there's a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue around the subject of empathy, you know, about our relationship to history, our relationship to different institutions, and certain practices and institutions that are oppressive. And so I feel like we're really in this moment where we're trying to figure out how to speak to each other and how to understand each other, at least how to communicate our own kind of unique, these subjective experiences in the world. So that's what's taking up my mind space, is thinking about communication, social engagement and communication right now. So of course, when I look at your work, you know, that's in the background. And I'm, you know, Nate, when I look at your work, when I think about your work, you're kind of evoking an empathetic understanding between like yourself and this familial history, right? You're working on a project, which I'm hoping you could talk to us a little bit more, where you're kind of quite literally planning to ride in an ancestor's kind of footsteps, or I guess trail, on horseback, you know? And Ayanah, I'm kind of interested in how your work functions as like a call to empathy towards our shared humanity, expressed in the ideas of love, care, generosity, and, you know, particularly like Black love, like you were speaking about, and queer love. So I was hoping that we can start the conversation maybe by addressing that, the subject of empathy, or how you might think of empathy as it relates to your practice.
Mhm.
And I want to, I should probably, as you're speaking, I just wanted to let everybody know that I'll be showing some images. And maybe we'll start with the works at DePaul, the installation at DePaul, and then Nate start with the installation at the Driehaus.
Yeah. Were you going to pull up one of those images
Yeah,
before I start, or?
Yeah, I'm gonna do that right now.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah, I mean, I was very intrigued by just the way that you approach kind of framing this, and the work at DePaul, it, in some ways is this kind of tongue-in-cheek play um, around the kind of notion of generosity, or what it might mean to think about a kind of offering in response to a set of conditions. So this is text that is a variation of a statement that has shown up in my work previously. This Blackness is just for you. And I'm very interested in how the viewer reader kind of wrestles with this text, what sense they make of it, the notion of address that's in the text. And this exhibition opportunity for me was a way to expand that language, to give it even more of a kind of dynamic quality. But the empathetic line that you're kind of drawing out is a very interesting way of getting to maybe the humanity that's at the core of this. Like underneath the humor is this attempt to get at a humanity that's often denied in terms of Black people. And I find that it's also pretty timely in regard to the kind of way that we're bombarded with these messages that speak to a kind of alliance with some of the struggle that is playing out right now and has historically played out, but in a particular way in this moment. So I like your sensitivity to the text, kind of moving past my gentle kind of rub or humor and getting to the heart of it, which is really about, what is your relationship to the conditions that Black people find themselves in this country and have been in historically.
Yeah, I really love this work. And as we kind of briefly talked about before, as I'm reading this, how you've how you've shuffled the words, and in some instances it becomes vernacular, and how I feel like certain versions speak to me. Like I feel like they're addressing me, where I feel like others are not. So is Blackness for you just this? I don't feel like I'm being addressed, but I do for this Blackness he just is, or the Blackness is just for you, or so it moves back and forth between, or me feeling like I'm being addressed or not being addressed.
It's I like the connection between how you introduced us, or your connection to Nate and I, and your remark that in this kind of loving remark, like, when I met you, I felt like, okay, I'm gonna be all right.
Yeah.
It's that quality that I'm actually interested in, right? That the work could evoke that.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're the recipient of the message, or find yourself in saying it to yourself, imagine yourself offering that text, or offering that message to someone. But that quality of visibility, or being seen, or comforted, or the notion that you're not being addressed, but you're kind of interested in this dynamic,
Yeah.
There's something really, for me, really lovely about your introduction relative to the kind of feeling that can emerge from the text, depending on who you are, your relationship to it.
Yeah.
I thought that selfie was just a fun moment
Yeah.
to both promote and also kind of experience what it means to be on that platform and kind of see that text in passing.
And you mentioned that this project is an iteration of this work. I remember seeing this piece in the show at the MCA, and do you remember the title of the show again?
The title is Direct Message, Art, Language, and Power.
Yes. I remember seeing this piece here, but also, as I went through your works, when did you start this? Maybe in 2000, was it 2012? I feel like that was the earliest image that I saw of this.
This particular statement?
Yeah.
I'm actually, I feel like it goes back maybe around that time. Yeah. Those were drawings that I had created when I was based in Pittsburgh. And I had a series of drawings at the Braddock Carnegie Library. And they were ink on brown paper, on craft paper. And that was kind of my first play with this kind of content, kind of delivered in this way.
Is this also a print?
It is not a print. In this case, no.
Okay. This one's a painting?
This one is ink wash on wood panel.
Okay.
And just building up layers and layers. So the experience of this kind of dripping, running pigment that is in the space around each letter it's a surface that I'm really excited by, and that I carried over in the DePaul paintings that led to the billboard.
And so maybe in keeping with the same question, I can jump to you, Nate, and your works. You can kind of introduce the installation of works that you have up at the Driehaus Museum, which, when did that show open? It opened during the pandemic, after your show at Monique.
Yeah, I can't remember. It feels like the pandemic has just been one long day.
Exactly, right?
During the pandemic is close enough. Well, it was about a month ago. So
I just remember that when it opened, I was really angry because I was like, shit, like they know we can't go out, And I was
right.
So I still haven't been able to see it. I don't have a car, so I don't have the mobility to kind of go see it. So I'm really curious, and we'll come back to these works with some other kind of questions that I have. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what we're seeing, because I'm assuming a lot of people haven't seen it. There's a lot of subtlety, subtle kind of elements in your work. You often use these holographic images, holograms.
I refer to them as holograms. Yeah.
Holograms, in your work that I know it's tricky to translate that in images, in photo documentation.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So maybe if you could describe a little bit more what we're looking at.
Yeah. I mean, it's a longer story, right? There's a lot of narrative behind the work. So I mean, just really briefly, the work refers to the stories that my grandmother and my father told me about my great-grandfather, so my father's mother's father, and his migration from the South to the North in the early 1900s and the early 1920s. He left Virginia or North Carolina and migrated to Philadelphia under duress. So, and the thing that interested me about the story was that there were a lot of things that were left out, and there were a lot of things that were unclear, because like a lot of people leaving the South at that time, when they arrived North, some of them didn't like to talk about it. either because it was too difficult to talk about, or because it was like taboo, or because it was actually dangerous for some folks to talk about it.
Mhm.
And he was, in a sense, he was fugitive. So I started thinking about how, in terms of, I mean, to go back to thinking about empathy, like, how is it that you can understand the existence of other people as human beings, or their existence, their actual existence at all? Like this kind of metaphysical question of one's, not only existentially of one's own, being, but if one can't even prove their own being existentially, how can one then presume that other people exist?
Well,
so
your great grandfather exists through the artifacts that are kind of left behind, or in the stories, and the stories themselves are not your great grandfather. They're kind of accounts of a life.
But I've been thinking a lot about like the potential of objects to prove certain kinds of things in history, but always kind of making the objects a little bit elusive. So with this piece, it's really difficult to see, actually, and sometimes you literally can't see that behind this black screen there are the bones of a horse, and as you approach the piece, the bones actually disappear. There's a sensor that senses the physical presence of your body and causes them to become invisible.
When does that happen? Like how close?
About a meter, I'd say, maybe 3.5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And once you get that close, they disappear. And when they disappear, there's a sound that starts to, emanate from the piece. And the sound is the sound of the bones kind of being shuffled and touching each other. It's all really subtle, It's all really, I want the work, I want there to be something in the work that you see, but you're not sure if you saw it, or you hear it and you're not sure you can hear it, like just on the edge of your perception.
Well, this is a great space to be showing that work, because I feel like your work really kind of touches on like the subject of, or responds to the subject of historicity, not and the actuality of events or people, not only through that family story, that personal story, but also within the context of the museum. These works are kind of formally in the architectural style of the space, but are not of the time of that time.
Right. I mean, like for me, the architecture, the institution, the museum, like if the architecture is part of the institution, then in some ways I started to think about those things as parallel to the objects in the sculpture as proof, as an authoritative mark that would prove that something is true or believable, or even for that matter, legible. To go back to like the inability to directly access the objects, or to access visibly access the image.
I just wanted to play this really quickly. Can you tell us about this other sculptural piece? Like I said, I don't have images of all the works, but I do have the image of the clock here and of this text-based work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This piece is a clock that I made, and it's actually a little bit difficult to see, but behind the pendulum, where the pendulum is swinging, there's like a hologram of a bone. You can faintly make it out in this image and video, but you can also very faintly make it out in person. And when you see it in person, it's really difficult to document, and even photographs kind of flatten it out. But the image of the bone looks like it recedes or floats in that middle space there. And then also the clock runs backwards. It's kind of a subtle thing. You can only see it if you're paying attention and you see the second hand moving. It's actually moving backwards. And I was thinking about like, you know, time travel and death. Like I was thinking about how I could commune with my great grandfather, like how I could inhabit and really experience his existence. And maybe that there was a potential to think about, if one were to think about time in a different way, they could empathize with the existence of people who like previously have inhabited the earth. And maybe that way of thinking about existence, like as in a collapsed time line, is similar to the way that we experience our own existence as well. So, I mean, the bones are like these artifacts that I want them to act like specters.
Yeah.
And then the painting is a text painting that I wrote. Again, like, I mean, it's interesting that when you brought up empathy, because when I was making the work, I hadn't thought about that, but I was thinking about how do I connect to him. When he was in his later years in life, he developed dementia and became depressed and actually attempted suicide. So these text paintings are me rewriting his suicide letter in my own handwriting and then converting them into a painting. At the same time, it's not like I'm painting the letters individually as if it were my handwriting. I'm kind of attempting to remove my own mark by the way I made the paintings is that I wrote the text and then I scanned the text and then I created a stencil essentially to then paint the text on. So it's all very mechanical.
Yes.
But I wanted it to look like it was something very personal, but it actually is something it's very mechanical.
Yeah. And I think that's a nice kind of segue into something else that I wanted to talk about is both of you and your work, your kind of use of text. We talked about it briefly before. And my second question was about, I'll just read it. One similarity that I find compelling in your work is your use of text, but more so like the resistance towards legibility of text, which is something I think a lot about. But in your works, like the different ways you render text. So there is, Ayanah, in your work too, there is also the hand kind of drafted, the handwritten. There's Nate, there's the scripted, but oftentimes you employ this typographical text. But even like you said here with the handwriting, there is a mechanical process in that, that creates a kind of distance, a little bit more of a distance. And I'd like to show a few images. I'm going to go into some examples of your work, Ayanah, by and about at the Mattress Factory Museum in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the legibility or the resistance and your use of text in this work, the layering? And
Yeah. The approach is to, in some ways, have a silkscreen perform like a drawing tool. My approach to the silkscreen is very hand-based. So I'm painting the space around the letter, which is for me this kind of conceptual gesture where I'm interested in shifting this notion of marginality, the kind of marginal space, the space around the letter is giving the letter shape. And it also allows me to cover more area, more surface area by focusing on the space around. And the screen, as I said, becomes this kind of drawing tool, which allows me to replicate this text multiple times, but it's also in conversation with the pre-existing material of in this case, the newspaper. And so there's something for me about the kind of legibility or obstruction that happens between this thing that already has a history and the gesture that I'm placing on top of it. And so the quality of maybe masking and covering or having something be revealed is a quality that I really enjoy. That there are these multiple ways of looking, and that becomes a kind of metaphor. So that you might have to look through this text to see something else, or that I'm overwhelming this existing source of information with the information that I want to make visible, right? In this case, these statements are by and about Black women. So that quality of the text shifting around the page and making some things visible and other things not is a really nice play for me.
Yeah, and I appreciate as a viewer the different ways of reading the text, of having access to the text, you know, through that obfuscation of the layers and some blocking and some masking. And, you know, as I read it, you know, I imagine there's a kind of intended structure, but as I read it, sentences or phrases are kind of broken up. And so I'm no longer kind of reading it in a conventional way, but I'm kind of moving around, which doesn't feel like an error or failure on my part, you know. So it's this very nice process of just interpreting the text. Nice isn't a good word, but just an interesting way for me to kind of question, interpret the text.
Yeah, I really, that resonates with me as well. Like I appreciate the way that it highlights the instability of language. You know, that, I mean, I read this as sampling Black romantic interiors, but I also read it as sampling Black or Black interiors, or sampling interiors, romantic Black. And you know, there's something about I won't call it typeface, but it's because it doesn't, like we were talking about this the other night, and you were saying it's not a typeface, essentially. Yeah, it's more like a handwritten text, you know, and that the handwritten text is connected to the body, and that language as it exits the body is like, it's really tricky, right? Because you have a sender and you have a receiver, and between the sender and the receiver, there's a break. And in that break, there's the possibility for multiple kinds of interpretations. And it's the way that the text is rendered, but it's also the layer, like you mentioned, Nyeema, the layering or the highlighting, like sampling Black interiors in that kind of darker red highlighted box, or the one on the left that says my melanin is relevant, it's something to be had, and that's kind of blocked out or highlighted. So depending on the way that the layers are interacting with each other, you can borrow words from one place and another place within the frame and create different kinds of, which is what is directly happening in the piece on the train stop, that you're actually remixing it in multiple different ways. So I think it creates a really interesting relationship between spoken language, written language, but it all goes back to the way that we understand language through our bodies. Like it's an interpretive process, language is. And because of that, it's not static. It's always kind of shifty.
Yeah.
And maybe that has relationship to the kind of destabilization of what we might consider a kind of essentialized Blackness.
Ooh, Nate. It's interesting because I was thinking about your work at the Driehaus, which I had the great fortune of seeing in person, and thinking about the reading of mimicry in some of the architectural moments that are reflected in your sculptures, but they become this space that allows you to deliver this narrative that reflects your family history and the ways that we can kind of engage with that, right? But there's something about the attention to the space around in which that narrative is being shared, that I find really compelling. And even though it's happening in a flat way with the work by and about, that I'm also kind of responding to this newsprint. You know, it's not the kind of physicality of being immersed in this museum, but there's something about reacting to this kind of given parameter that I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
And Nate, I want to go into some of the text works that are present in works like Sepulchre. Let's see. I wish I need to move this tab here. But these works that were in your exhibition in Transcendence of Time, and how you brought text in there, the visibility or the inability to read the text narratives that are in these works. And these are also, if I'm not mistaken, are these referencing the suicide?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to like, it's a good transition in some way, because these pieces were all about highlighting certain elements of that text. So I wanted to use the bones as a way to block out elements of the text and highlight other elements of the text, so that maybe simultaneously the text talked about death and at the same time talked about some other thing. Like, so essentially I was thinking about them as ways of communicating the burial location of the horse that my great-grandfather rode from the south to the north and then had to euthanize and bury because he was fugitive. And so he killed the horse in order to hide the horse. And then later on, I recovered the body and unearthed the body of the horse. So the bones are the thing that leads me to its own location, but only through an anachronistic way of thinking about time. That simultaneously I'm inhabiting the present time and the time in the past, and then also another time further in the past. If that makes sense. I don't know. I mean,
it makes sense, but I also like the way that that's reflected in, again, like the resistance with the text, the Black text, against the kind of the Blackness inside of the box, and the inability to completely grasp the text, you know, and to be able to read it and have access to it. There's some work that has to be done.
Yeah, and language is, sometimes language feels like it's the best way to communicate something. But once we start to utilize it as a tool, we quickly realize how faulty it is, how much it fails at what it attempts to do.
And how it can be manipulated and how it can be interpreted. I think we see that. I mean, come on, this I hate to keep mentioning this presidency, but and his use of language, and I'm just like, my God, did he say that? Or how, you know, the ability to say something contradictory, but then to refuse it, and then it's just this, yeah.
And I mean, I think there are ways of doing that in a way that's intentional and kind of challenges that idea in the first place. Like this Blackness is just for you. It's like, and we were talking about this other night too, like this Blackness is just for you. It in some way means like there's an exclusivity of Blackness that's just for Black folk. Like this Blackness is just for you means you means us. But in another way, like even if you emphasize the word this and say this Blackness is just for you, then it's like, oh, that's other Blackness, about a different kind of Blackness.
I'm not getting where's the other Blackness? I'm not getting,
Right. It's like, oh, that Blackness. Oh yeah, I know about that one. That was.
Yes, the emphasis. And then here, you know, you're using text. I'll show a little bit of your drawings as well, but the use of text here, but it's not the kind of handwritten scripted text. And can you, because I've always was a little bit confused and was asking you about the relationship, this narrative about the jockey Is that also related to the story of your great grandfather, or is that next to?
It's a next to. It's like, you know, like it's when I use the text that's more typeface, it's usually a reference to something historical, a broader history, like a broader kind of social history, like the history of Black jockeys in the sport of horse racing is like a kind of a lost history. But it all makes sense. I mean, some people may say, "Oh, Black people riding horses, that sounds strange," but it's not that strange at all. Like there are tons of Black cowboys, and there were tons of Black jockeys, and it's sort of a pragmatic relationship, Black folks and horses, because Black folks were slaves in the South where horses were being raised, and they were the ones who were tending the stables and taking care of the horses, and horses trust the people who feed them and care for them and are around them all the time. So I was thinking about my great grandfather's relationship to the horse and how that paralleled the way that Black jockeys come about.
And Ayanah, in your work, there's a work of yours, All My Girlfriends, where you're referencing the cultural text from Jet magazines. Can you talk about that as well? Although the text isn't present, you know, formally, it's spoken through the script. The script is part of the process, but it's a sound piece. But could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like hearing kind of Nate's methodology around how it's being indicated that the text is historic versus the kind of tapping into an ancestor's hand through this kind of practice of a kind of copying or to try to as best he can kind of capture the script, right? There are times when I'm using a text that I've appropriated, but the way that it's being delivered through my hand doesn't necessarily indicate that. And I'm actually interested in this like slippage between the relationship that I have through the text, the relationship that I have to the text through this process of writing or through the process of speaking in the case of this work. So you're looking at the site of an installation of the sound piece, which was the elevator in the Andy Warhol Museum. And to the right, just to cue you in of the process, this is the script, an example of the script that I read, these multiple hours worth of Jet Beauty of the Week profile descriptions. Which is this way of kind of internalizing the text and also the kind of intimacy of speaking this text and the kind of imagining of a relationship to the women that are on display in this publication. For those not familiar, this is a swimsuit spread that was in Jet magazine, a weekly publication. And kind of Reader's Digest size, although I don't know if that reference helps anybody right now, but a very small
under a certain age, it's about
a very small publication. And then just this kind of humorous way of inserting some autobiography or this way of embedding a kind of same gender loving desire within a publication to whom might not put that on display. And so within this Black publication, to imagine myself or my desire being visible within it, within this Black publication, is this other way of making that Blackness just for me, in a funny way.
And you know, I want this to kind of lead us to the last question I had, speaking about an an intimacy and a longing for connection. You know, before I kind of talked about being isolated in this moment and a kind of philosophical or ideological estrangement, and also physically being, you know, removed from each other. And I'm wondering, you know, now in the past, how long has it been? 7 months, 8 months? I don't know. Do you guys, do the two of you feel any increased sense of urgency in your works as an expression of an inner will or desire to connect to others, to connect to yourselves, to family history, to the future? Like, has that increased? Do you get a feeling of urgency now, maybe more than before?
You want to go there first, Nate?
Yeah, I mean, I can address that. I mean, I was thinking about that when I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine, Devin Mays, like I don't know, a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about how we feel now, and he was saying, and I felt the same way. Like, I don't feel any different now than I did last year,
Exactly.
or the year before, or the year before that. But the difference now is, like, white folks now ask me, "Are you doing all right?" And I'm like,
boom.
No, not really. But I mean, I feel the same. I'm already used to feeling this way.
But what about just the isolation, even from your peers?
Oh,
you know?
yeah. Well,
not so much even the broader social isolation, but even the more nuanced kind of, yeah.
Definitely. I mean, in terms of the pandemic, yeah, I don't know. I miss people.
Yeah, but you know what? Also, it just seems like the pandemic, but even what's going on politically, like, it's the communication. We've got this really fraught kind of communication, or a corrosion of discourse. So that seems really frustrating. So for me, it feels so much more urgent to kind of clarify it, or at least maybe find some way of communicating that makes sense, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm watching people speak, and I'm just like, you know, news on the street or watching pundits, and I'm just like, what are you talking about? Like, this doesn't make sense, you know?
yeah, I mean, it's the urgency is always present in as much as I need my work to kind of survive, right? Like, I need my work as a space to imagine the reality that I want. I need it to satisfy the drive in me for a certain kind of creative output. But the conditions of the moment for me are always the conditions.
Always the same,
you know,
yeah.
Unfortunately.
But you're not fantasizing harder. That's
No,
what I'm saying, you know?
I mean, the work is liberatory always.
Yeah.
And sadly, you know, we're in a country in which there are legacies that are still being, you know, addressed.
Yeah.
Sadly, still just fighting to be human, you know.
Yeah.
We just trying to live, you know.
Yeah.
But the work has consistently been an outlet for me to kind of give myself power, or imagine what I want to see, or the love that I want, or, you know, that's remained the same.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ayanah, Nate, and Nyeema. I will love now to invite everyone here, if you feel comfortable, to turn your videos on, so we feel like sort of we're in the same room. And we'd love to hear from you, comments, questions. I invited everyone to either write your questions in the chat, but also please feel free to ask them out loud. You can raise your hand in the participants. There's a little icon to raise your hand, and then you can unmute. I can call your name, and then you can unmute yourself to ask the question. And for some reason, if you don't find that icon, you can also unmute yourself and wave.
Looks like
No pressure.
No pressure. No.
Gabe has a question.
Hey, I can hop in. Hey, everybody. That was an awesome conversation. Thank you so much. And hey, everybody out there in the audience. Nyeema, your question about empathy, like right off the bat, had me thinking about subject-object relationships, right? In the philosophical terms, and as artists and object makers, how subjectivity has like unique platforms to be perceived, created, talked about. And how, you know, there are moments where it feels like the subjectivity is not only just a real thing out there that's then uttered or like represented, but is even created, right, in the artwork. And so thinking about that idea connected to the point about the writing not being a typeface, that it's handwriting and it's coming from the body, and that carpentry, and that this drawing, this painting is, if nothing else, super bodily in like how it emerges, the subjectivity emerges. And so thinking about, yeah, what you guys think about creating subjectivity and how that gets wrapped up with saying, yes, this grandfather is a real person out there. Yes, this Blackness are real people out there, but also how it moves through your body and how it becomes real in terms of how you particularly are creating it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have a thought in relation to that. Lately, I've been thinking about the potential that history is not real in the way that we conventionally think about it as something that definitively happened. And I'm not necessarily talking just about, you know, distant history. I'm talking about even like recent history, like what I ate for breakfast. Because what I ate for breakfast only exists in the consciousness of my own present existence, you know? So maybe the only way, like, and if someone is no longer living, then maybe they don't have the same kind of present consciousness in the way that we do, as like people still, you know, thinking and being in the world. So I've been thinking that the only way to prove the existence of my great grandfather is to actually, and Nyeema brought this up in the beginning, is to actually like walk on the trail that he walked on when he rode the horse from North Carolina to Philadelphia. So I bought a horse and I'm gonna ride the horse from North Carolina to Philadelphia in order to prove that he exists. But coincidentally, that also proves that I exist because he preceded my existence, you know? So it's kind of this like, maybe it's like a causal loop in time travel. So
yeah,
I think I'm time traveling. Time travel is the only way to prove the subjectivity of any existence.
I mean, I really like that, the image that you created for me, Nate, in that response. And I'm also thinking about proof and thinking about what it means to kind of conjure through following the path, right? That for me is less proof and more this form of recognition and memorial and to kind of tap into that through your body, right? In much the same way that one might hide their religion in another religion, right? It's like, you know, it's like when I hear you tell that story about your family's connection to Virginia and North Carolina, I'm like, my people are from North Carolina and Virginia, right?
Yeah.
And so in listening to you describe this journey on the horse, there's something that I latch on to, even though that's not necessarily, you know, a literal story connected to my family, but I feel that sense of connection, right? That I can imagine that journey or that pursuit of liberation. So there's something really nice about this kind of like not the proof, but something through the body, right? Making a decision about revisiting these stories through the body that feels really relevant.
Yeah, we don't do that enough. in the US. Like in Germany, like they remember the Holocaust.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they have actual things, physical objects, monuments, you know, kind of pilgrimages. But we don't remember that kind of like, I mean, to go back to your question about the urgency of the moment, it's like, it's not anymore. I just feel like it's not any more urgent now than it always has been.
Right.
I'm not doing anything differently today than I would have made the work last year or the year before. But I think it's really important. But yeah, because you're right, Ayanah, it's not about me. It's not about my grandfather's journey and me. Yes, in the way that it's materializing it is, but it's also about your people too. I mean, it's an homage to many people. Almost 7 million people.
Indeed. We can't even agree on 1618. I mean, you know, that's the extent. You're talking about memorials. We can't even agree on basic, you know?
Right.
That's our challenge.
Right.
That's why we got to make work, Nate.
That's, yeah.
I see a question or more of a comment perhaps from Caroline Kent on the chat for Ayanah. And she says, I thought of your text works covering the walls of the exhibition space as hand-painted signs that one may encounter in and throughout a neighborhood. I think of where we are seeing hand-painted signs of text and the kinds of messages that feel for a people that operate generously in the space that language conjures. At least that's how I like to think of those works operating outside gallery space in the real world. Maybe.
Caroline Kent. Yes. Beautifully said. I hope that it functions that way in the world. I like that museum gallery space, but I also like being in the world in a different way.
Any other final love messages, questions, comments? All right. Well, thank you so much. Okay. One question came. Hello, I wonder if you could elaborate on the relationship between your work and collective individual memory. That's from Eric Mueller.
That's a good one.
Sorry, I was muted. I think the way that you were talking about, I mean, when I was talking about the horse and then the way that you were talking about the collective, how it relates to a broader set of experiences is the way that I would think about it. I mean, the way that I always think about my work, at least, is that there's a subject in the work, and the subject is the material, it's the narrative, it's the literal text, it's the objects, you know, the bones. Those are all subjects in the work. And if someone encounters the work and thinks, oh, this work is about Nate's history and familial history, and he wants us to understand that story, then I don't think that maybe I've done something wrong. Maybe I need to figure out a way to make it expand, because the content level of their work is more about the collective experience of being a subject in the world, being a social subject in the world. So I'm using the individual subjectivity, hopefully, to talk about a broader collectivity. And I mean, I have ideas about the way that Ayanah's work relates to broader, but I'll let you talk about it.
And it's hard. How do you? It's hard for me to even think about separating the two. You know, creating that separation. But yeah, Ayanah.
I mean, I'm interested in these different opportunities to enter the work. I'm interested in these different entry points to create these different forms of accessibility. Someone also asked about 1619. I'm simply reflecting some of the debate around the New York Times spread that acknowledged, the anniversary of when Africans were brought here, and that that seems an obvious thing to recognize, and yet there's debate around it.
Right.
The fact of that, right? And so that's maybe a good place to think about this question of memory. What we choose to remember, right? Remembering is as much as a decision about what we want to remember, what we want to revisit, and where our kind of patriotic kind of narrative meets the realities of folks to whom the kind of grand narrative is not the experience that was had, So yes, we are a nation of immigrants, but if we only say that we're a nation of immigrants, you're erasing a lot of people that came here without, much agency. So I'm, there are times in my work where I like text that has a quality of contradiction or has something that might shift, because I'm drawn to that kind of complexity, and complexity is of interest to me because I'm often denied complexity. Love looks like this. Love doesn't look like this.
Right.
Hi, Devin.
All right, well, thank you so much to the three of you. Again, a lovely and very important conversation to have. Thanks to everyone that joined us, and have a good evening. Plus, please check DePaul's website for future programs and events. Thank you and have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.